me start by pointing out that although it's not unusual to discuss the literature of the 1920s as the literature of the 1920s, it's somewhat arbitrary to pick a date and to go with the next 10 years and to have that be the framing device for the analysis of literature. But in the case of the 1920s, it's kind of appropriate because you have the decade bookended on both sides by the armistice in 1919 and by the stock market crash in 1929. And between those years, you do have a sense of something really unique happening in the course of American cultural history. And the writers of this era, especially the younger ones, many of whom are referred to as the lost generation, they saw themselves as connected with the life of the century because they were born mostly around 1900. And in fact, that's true of the writer that I'm going to be focusing on today, Langston Hughes, who published his first poem of his career in June of 1921 in the Crisis magazine. You can tell that this is a 1920s document because it has these very awkward swastikas, which the NAACP, which published Crisis magazine, tended to adorn the different editions of Crisis until the symbol was corrupted by the Nazi Party in the mid-1930s. At that point, the editor of Crisis, W.B. Du Bois, who was stridently anti-fascist and anti-colonialist, he made sure that the symbol was removed. But let's take a look at Langston Hughes's first published poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. And I want to take a look at it in a number of ways, including in a manner that's suggested by the state teaks, but also in a manner that's suggested by the decade, by the 1920s. So let's take a look. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. If we think about this poem, as I said before, in the terms that are suggested by the teaks, I'll start off by pointing out, I'm not sure which of these genre categories that the teaks outlines I would place the poem in. It probably fits into multiple of them. I would maybe eliminate classical, but I think it can be discussed in some of the other ways in terms of how it's contemporary, in terms of how it's diverse, how it's traditional even. It borrows heavily from Walt Whitman and Carl Sandburg and the spirituals. It's also possible to think about how the text is structured to achieve the author's purpose. I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, especially in relation to the 1920s. But if we think about some of the elements of prosody, that is the structure of the poem as a mixture of rhythm and sound, then I think it is easy to analyze. It has 5 stanzas, for example, although you wouldn't necessarily know it from this printing in the Crisis. This indentation, which is later removed by Langston Hughes himself, suggests that it's only 9 lines and maybe 5 stanzas, but it's 10 lines. We know that because most of the lines that are indented fully to the left indicate the start of a new line. And it's helpful, I think, to ask students why. Why is it 5 stanzas? Why is it 10 lines? Why is each line beginning a sentence and ending with the closing punctuation? I'm not going to say that I have any particular insight into those questions, because I think the more interesting question has to do with some of Langston Hughes's word choices. Why does he know the rivers and not some other particular word choice? Why has his soul grown deep like the rivers and not another word choice? I think these are much more interesting questions. And most important, who is the I of the poem? Who is the speaker of the poem? Whenever I ask my students to share with me who they think, out of all the famous people in the world, who should perform this poem, who would do the best job performing it, they almost invariably say this name, Morgan Freeman. And I tell them they are exactly right. In fact, I've incorporated this question into most lectures about the Negro Speaks of Rivers. And so I will sometimes include an online poll and ask them, how many of you were thinking Morgan Freeman when I asked you who would best perform the poem? And usually about 75 or 80% of them will say, yeah, I was thinking of Morgan Freeman. And Morgan Freeman has the perfect voice for this poem because it's kind of gravelly and deep, and it suggests age and wisdom, and he would get the tone just right, I think, because of those elements of his vocal performance that we're so familiar with. I would encourage you to go onto YouTube and find a recording of Langston Hughes reading this poem. They're plentiful, and you may be surprised that Langston Hughes doesn't really do such a great job reading his own poem because he lacks the gravelly voice that Morgan Freeman possesses that I think this poem really, really calls for. When Hughes wrote this poem, he had never traveled to Africa or to the Middle East or to Asia, even though he refers to those places in the poem. He would later, in just a couple of years, travel to these places. But he had seen the Mississippi. He had traveled along the Mississippi, even though he was, get this, only 19 years old when he wrote this poem. I tell my students, how many of you have written a world famous poem by the age of 19? They're mostly 19 or over. And of course, none of them have. Of course, neither have I, and I'm 50. And yet Langston Hughes wrote this poem at 19, and it doesn't sound like the voice of a 19-year-old. It is the voice of someone who transcends time and who transcends space. In fact, he refers to the dawn of civilization in the Euphrates and the Fertile Crescent. He refers to the Congo in a way that suggests antiquity. He refers to the Nile and to some of the great masterpieces of early civilization. And he does so in a way that exudes familiarity and that boasts of wisdom. And so it doesn't sound like the poem that would be spoken by a 19-year-old, but nor does it sound necessarily like a poem that speaks of the 1920s. In fact, the poem positions itself in history as post mid-19th century. But I want to suggest that it is indeed a poem of the 1920s in a number of ways. It is a poem that is asking us to rethink what it means to be African American at a fraught time in US history. If you think about what immediately precedes this poem, written in 1920, published in 1921, it is fresh on the heels of the Red Summer. That was the summer of interracial violence that really scarred America, including a number of places in Texas. Multiple riots occurred in Texas. Typically, it was white mobs that were exerting themselves on Black communities, and this was running rampant throughout the United States. It would have been fresh on Langston Hughes's mind, and it was definitely referenced in every single issue of the NAACP's Crisis, which beginning in 1915 started to nationalize the civil rights cause. And it was really one of the major impetuses of the Harlem Renaissance, or the Negro Renaissance, as it was known at the time. If we think about Langston Hughes's own specific experience, what I've done here is gone to this excellent Monroe and Florence work interactive website that catalogs racial violence in the United States. And I have selected only the years of Langston Hughes's life from 1902 to the publication of The Negro Speaks of Rivers in 1921. And you see that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of examples of anti-Black racial violence. Hundreds of lynchings would have occurred during the first 19 years of Langston Hughes's life, many of them occurring right here along the Mississippi River in the Mississippi Delta. And so Hughes would have associated the Mississippi not just with Abe Lincoln and not just with being sold down the river into slavery, but also with ongoing anti-Black racial violence. In fact, Hughes would later record the moment that he wrote the poem, and he wrote it with a view towards rehabilitating the image of the African American in the American cultural imagination. He was part of this larger Harlem Renaissance movement that includes the New Negro Anthology, and it includes this famous image captured on film by James Vanderzee. And it was part of a much broader effort to rehabilitate anti-Black stereotypes and to replace them with a new, updated, and much more modern version of what it meant to be African American at this moment in history. Why Harlem? Well, the simple fact is that most African Americans who lived in New York City lived in a few blocks in Harlem because of residential segregation. They simply couldn't rent an apartment in other parts of the city, and this is true throughout the United States. But let me go back to the poem and to Hughes's account of when he wrote the poem. He wrote the poem, as I said, when he was 19 years old. He had just graduated from high school. He was on his way from his mother's house in Ohio to visit his father. And he was traveling by train across the Mississippi River just outside of St. Louis, late one afternoon in the early evening, and the sun was setting over the river, and he saw the river aglow with the sunlight, and the thought occurred to him, the phrase occurred to him, "I've known rivers." He took out an envelope and jotted the poem down, as he says, in the next 10 or 15 minutes. So one of the most famous poems of the 20th century was written in 10 minutes by a 19-year-old on his way to see his father. He was on his way to see his father, who was an expatriate living in Mexico at the time. And so he was on his way from St. Louis to San Antonio, as it happens, that summer in 1920. And it was in San Antonio that he would take a connecting train that would go the rest of the way to Mexico City, where his father was waiting for him. As he was traveling from St. Louis to San Antonio, he probably had in mind this apartment, which is where his father lived in Mexico City, just outside the Zocalo. I took this photo last summer, I believe, and the apartment is still there. There's no indication that anyone knows that Langston Hughes once lived there. I walked inside this door. It's an internet cafe and copy shop, and they had no idea that Langston Hughes used to live in what is now an internet cafe. which is unfortunate. But this is where Langston Hughes spent about 1.5 years of his life subsequent to publishing The Negro Speaks of Rivers. He sent the poem to Crisis Magazine in New York City from Mexico City. It was the second time that he had visited Mexico City to see his father. He had previously gone the year before, and once before as well when he was a young boy at age 5. Between Mexico City and St. Louis, Hughes would have visited this train station on the west side of San Antonio, the International and Great Northern Railroad. It was where the Missouri Pacific rail line ran through San Antonio. It now houses the VIA bus multimodal transit center. You can visit it. It still retains the facade and the stained glass, although it no longer has this ticket window. I include an image of the ticket window because this is where Langston Hughes would have had an interesting choice to make as he was returning from Mexico City on his way back to St. Louis. At this ticket window, Hughes, because he was fluent in Spanish, could and in fact did sometimes purchase a ticket in Spanish, claiming not to be African American, but to be Mexican. Why did he do this? He did this because the trains at this time, as you probably know, were segregated. If you were African American, you could not purchase an electric lighted sleeper berth. You could not make a reservation in the diner, but instead you had to sleep in a chair car. So this 20+ hour train ride from San Antonio to St. Louis, you would have to spend in a chair. If you were African American, you couldn't purchase a sleeper. Hughes, though, would purchase a sleeper berth on occasion because he could. And this, I think, adds a really interesting resonance to the poem when we think about it, not in terms of transcending space and time, but instead as documenting a particular moment in American history. What does it mean for the eye to know rivers like the Mississippi, or for that matter, the Rio Grande, and to cross those rivers, inhabiting one social position or another based on the language in which you purchase the train ticket? I think it's a really interesting question to ask. I'm going to say a bit more about that particular facet of Langston Hughes's careers, that is his multilingualism, in a little bit later when we have more back and forth. But for now, I'm going to return to the poem one last time and ask you to think about that word soul once again. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Soul is typically understood in relation to the body. The soul is that part of us that transcends the body, that transcends life and death. The soul is that part of us which outlives the self that is bound by the human body. It is also, if you look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and I'm going to quote the dictionary entry, soul is the emotional or spiritual quality of African American life and culture. The OED traces this meaning of the word soul back only as far as 1946. But I would beg to differ. I think it goes back at least to 1921 and to this poem. And if we think about how Hughes's soul has grown deep like the rivers, I think he's asking us to identify an emotional or spiritual quality of African American life and culture. And he asks us further to rethink American history and the place of African American society within the context of that history. I'll look forward to your questions. And now I think I will turn it over to Jim. Jim, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Michael. I'm going to get my screen set up for sharing with everybody. Okay, I hope you all can see that. Michael, thanks for a fantastic presentation. Regrettably, my hometown appears on your map of places where there was racial violence. In Springfield, Illinois, a particularly notorious one that I grew up hearing about. It was especially notorious because Springfield's also Abraham Lincoln's hometown too. So good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you, Sarah, for your very, very kind introduction. I do have in mind, as I share a few thoughts with you on Native American literature, Sarah's conceptual framework. You know, I'm thinking, perhaps not explicitly, but at least I have in mind time and space and people. I also am in full agreement with much of what Claudia said yesterday, but in particular with a point that she made near the end of her talk about treating historical documents as literary texts. And so this is something that I do as well. By doing that, it opens up a much broader range of Native authored texts to talk about. So thanks again, Sarah, for the introduction. Thank you, Marissa and Eric and everyone at Humanities Texas for inviting me to participate in this great event. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about Native American writing in the 1920s, the decade known, of course, primarily for the Harlem Renaissance and for the debut of modernist American writers such as Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Native Americans were very much a part of this world too, as I hope to demonstrate by focusing on three of the most well-known Native writers of this particular era. In the first slide, you'll see photos of those three writers. You'll see Gertrude Bonnin, and right here, you'll see Lynn Riggs. He's right here. This is a photo taken when he was traveling the Chautauqua circuit with a few of his friends. And then here's Will Rogers in full cowboy dress. The other photo shows Native veterans of World War I, of course, the major historical event, as Michael noted, that shaped much of the world of the 1920s. These three writers will probably defy most, if not all, of your students' expectations about Native Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century. That is, if they have expectations at all. As a conceptual framework for my brief comments, I'll emphasize what I see as the main identity of these writers. So Gertrude Bonnin is our activist's voice. Lynn Riggs is our artist's voice, and Will Rogers is our humorist's voice. But really, they're all three activists and artists in their own way, if perhaps not all humorists. I don't think Bonnin and Riggs are really ever particularly funny. But I do this in part because when teaching Native American literature, it's really important to provide students with a range of writers to demonstrate the diversity of voices within American Indian literature. Of course, Bonnin and Riggs and Rogers are not the only Native writers publishing their work in the interwar years from the 20s to the 40s. This slide shows you a short list of some other writers. I'll point out to you Todd Downing. He's a Choctaw writer who wrote some detective novels in the 1930s, all of them set either in Texas, Mexico, or both. And though he doesn't write about Choctaws in those detective novels, he does write about issues important to indigenous people in Mexico, issues that they share with indigenous people in the United States. For example, some of the crimes committed in his detective novels involve the theft of indigenous human remains or the theft of other kinds of cultural property. I'll also point out to you also John Joseph Matthews, an Osage writer who wrote a novel in the 30s called Sundown, in which he addresses the context of all the violence committed against Osages in the 1920s. This is the Osage Reign of Terror. It's a historical episode that has had a few books written about it recently. I think there's a film in production about it as well. It was the first case with which the FBI was tasked with solving. And so this is something that Matthews, as an Osage himself, of course, was deeply interested in. Of all these writers, Bonnin is the one that, in my experience, my students most appreciate. I think it's really important to say that she was born and lived through nearly a constant state of war or the threat of war. Since in the 1860s, including during the Civil War, in the 1870s and the 1880s, the Northern and Southern Great Plains were almost constantly in the midst of conflict between the US Army and a wide number of Native American tribal nations. So she's born into this world in 1876. This is, of course, the United States centennial. It's also the year of the Battle of the Little Big Horn. When Bonnin was 8 years old, in events that she documents in American Indian Stories, she attended one of the boarding schools for Native students called White's Manual Labor Institute in Wabash, Indiana. In 1890, when she's home from school, she visits with her family and then departs right before the Wounded Knee massacre. At that time, her path crosses with Charles Alexander Eastman, a writer who's come up, I think, in at least one of the earlier presentations. He was the doctor on call at Wounded Knee or at Pine Ridge during the Wounded Knee massacre. And he addresses this episode in From the Deep Woods to Civilization in chapters 6 and 7. These are chapters from that long book that I often select to teach to my students too. In it, in other words, you're getting the perspective of a Dakota on the slaughter of people who are really related to him. She then goes on to attend Earlham College, where she has a celebrated career as an orator. And she ends up teaching at Carlisle. She's subsequently fired from Carlisle for a reason I'll mention in a few minutes. She enrolls at the New England Conservatory of Music. She's very much an accomplished violinist. She's also the co-author of an opera called the Sundance Opera. She publishes Old Indian Legends in 1901. This is a book that we were talking about earlier this morning that I think has some good selections for those of you who teach in middle school. In it, Bonnin translates from the Dakota language some of the stories about tricksters and monsters and so on. They're really wonderful translations. And I think very accessible to middle school readers. I often teach them to my own students, actually, because they're really often very complex stories that have an colonial and anti-racist component to them. That is, the monsters or the tricksters in these stories are often stand-ins for settlers or other colonialists. In 1902, Bonnin marries and goes to a Ute reservation in Utah, where she takes up community organizing. She returns to public life when she's elected Secretary of the Society of American Indians, the first pan-Native political organization, and for a brief time at least, a very influential one. In 1921, she publishes American Indian Stories, and in 1924, the Society of American Indians achieves one of its main goals, and that is to secure citizenship for all Native Americans. The SAI, because of internal fighting amongst various factions, dissolves. Bonnin addresses the political vacuum that creates by establishing the National Council of American Indians. So as you'll see on the slide here, I've just highlighted a few of the details in red. And these details are just to point to significant moments in Bonnin's life, ones that motivated her political activism throughout her entire career. Now, the most important experience for Bonnin then was her time at the boarding schools, or at the boarding school at White's Manual Institute. And when I teach Bonnin, you know, I always give my students the long history of the boarding schools, because it's so important for understanding the stance that Bonnin takes in American Indian stories. And it's also just harrowing. So on this slide, you'll see a small photograph of some Native American prisoners of war. So as I mentioned earlier, the northern and southern plains were in a constant state of turmoil and conflict and violence. This all happening in the homelands of Native people. In the 1870s, the US Army decided to take some of the POWs from those conflicts to Fort Marion in Florida, where they would be incarcerated as far as possible away from their tribal nations and their families. Once there, the person in charge, Richard Henry Pratt, decides that he's going to try a social experiment. He's going to try to turn these hardened Native warriors into white men. This involves making them dress in the way you see here in the photograph, cutting their hair, learning English, and learning some manual labor skills like blacksmithing. Pratt thought that this experiment was so successful that he petitioned the federal government to create schools for Native children. That is, he wanted to do the same thing that he did to the Native soldiers to Native children. This petition was accepted by the federal government, and he was allowed to open the first Native American boarding school, Carlisle, one that you might have heard of either because of the boarding school history there, or because in the 19-teens it had the best amateur football team in the country, fielding athletes such as, for example, Jim Thorpe. As you can see from the photograph, he dressed the students in the same way that he dressed the Native soldiers. In fact, the motto for the boarding schools was "Kill the Indian and save the man." The violence then involved in this particular kind of pedagogy is not disguised at all here. In fact, when the students arrived at the boarding school, their possessions were taken from them, destroyed, burned, usually, their clothes, their ceremonial blankets, their jewelry, anything that their parents gave to them. Their hair was cut, and they were forced to stop speaking their indigenous languages. as you can see from the previous photo, then too, this is happening to children separated from their parents as young as 6, 7, 8 years old. The cutting of the hair was particularly traumatic for the young people, since in most Native cultures, one would cut her hair only as an expression of mourning, or if one was a captive. And of course, for a lot of the students, if not all of them, being at the boarding school was traumatic enough that it felt as if they were a captive, and it felt as if they were, in fact, in mourning. One of the ways that Pratt devised to promote killing the Indian and saving the man was to publish these before and after photos that I also share with my students because of how sad and poignant they are. You can see from the photographs the physical change that the trauma of the experience of the boarding schools affects on the students. This one is perhaps the most famous. This is Tom Torlino. He was a Navajo student. Here's his before and after photograph. And then I included this one as well for you. These are three young Native women. I feel like we should name them: Carrie Anderson, Anna Dawson, and Sarah Walker. You can see them huddled up against the wall. This has probably happened right after they arrived at the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. And then you see them posed there in a domestic scene. So this is the kind of experience that Gertrude Bonnin had at White's Manual Institute. And it's one that she documents in American Indian Stories. And I think that I'd like to just make one point about this before moving on to Lynn Riggs. I'm thinking in particular about the point that Michael was making about the use of structure by writers to achieve the author's purpose. And the structure of the impressions of an Indian childhood, the school days of an Indian girl, and an Indian teacher among Indians is absolutely crucial for understanding what Bonnin is up to here. So this part of American Indian Stories does not tell a story of uplift through education, which is what would have been expected at the time. It's what reform discourse at the time would have been dedicated to promoting. The idea that you would find marginal, disenfranchised populations, give them an institutional, by which they would mean Anglo education, and this would then result in the language of the time, racial uplift. But Bonnin does not tell this story. Her story moves from what's happening in a Dakota context in impressions of an Indian childhood: happiness and joy, freedom, independence, dignity, respect for each other, to something much worse in the school days of an Indian girl, where in a context of Anglo education, she lives through a confusing, unpredictable, regimented day based in fear and the threat of punishment. And so as you'll see, the first two sections each have 7 small vignettes, and Bonnin very cleverly pairs episodes in the first set of 7 with the second set of 7. This then anticipates what she does in the final 4 sections, where she shows how this experience of moving from a Dakota educational world to an Anglo educational world then motivates or drives her political awakening. It will not surprise you to learn then that after she publishes these articles in several prestigious periodicals at the turn of the century, about 20 years before they come out in book form in American Indian Stories, it won't surprise you that she was fired from Carlisle for publishing these particular essays. I've given you a few resources. I'll just point you to one in particular, though I think they're all very useful. Carlisle has a digital resource center that's open to anyone who wants to use it. It has an absolutely extraordinary, and I think I would describe as devastating, archive of what it was like for the students to attend there. So there's student work, student publications, photographs, student records, those kinds of things. It would be a great resource for your students to do some research on their own. So the second writer that I think is somebody that you could incorporate into your courses is Lynn Riggs. He's standing in as the artist's voice, though as is clear from his plays and a lot of his personal letters, many of which are available at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Riggs was very much a lefty, very much somebody who was interested in social change, in documenting the lives of marginalized and disenfranchised people, whether they were Native people or economically underprivileged people, etc. But he takes a different approach than Bonnin, as I hope will become clear in just the minute or two that I'll spend on him. So like Bonnin, he was not born in the United States. I think that's something really important to say about this particular generation of Native writers. Riggs was born in the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory. He was a citizen of the Cherokee Nation until Oklahoma statehood in 1907. It was in 1907 then that Oklahoma became a state. And when that happened, all of the Native governments in Oklahoma were dissolved. There's a very interesting and relatively unknown historical fact about this time period. There was an effort to create a predominantly Native state called Sequoia. There was even a convention on it, but that was unsuccessful. If it had been, we would have about half the area of contemporary Oklahoma being predominantly white and called Oklahoma, and the other half being predominantly Native and called Sequoia. So Riggs then lives through this as a very young boy. He lives through the traumatic effect of losing your nation. When he gets older, he goes to the University of Oklahoma. He eventually moves to Santa Fe and then New York. He gets linked into some of the literary networks that were present both in Santa Fe and New York, met a lot of writers more famous than he was, writers who also, by the way, knew and tried to support Langston Hughes. He wins a Guggenheim Fellowship and goes to France, like a lot of American expatriate writers. In fact, in some of the words that he shares with us about that particular experience, he talks about seeing some of these writers walking along the streets of Paris, for example. He's excited to be near the center, but he never quite gets into the center. But while on the Guggenheim, he writes Green Grow the Lilacs, which competes for the Pulitzer Prize. He becomes a Hollywood scriptwriter, like a lot of other writers at the time, including F. Scott Fitzgerald and William Faulkner. He hated it, Riggs, I mean, by the way, though there are a lot of really fun photographs of him hanging out with people like Betty Davis and Joan Crawford. In 1941, he served as a visiting professor at Baylor University. All the archives of his classes there are available, actually, and really interesting. And in 1943, Rodgers and Hammerstein's first collaboration is Oklahoma, a play based on Riggs's Green Grow the Lilacs. So just two contexts that are important for thinking about the poem that I selected for you all to read. It's complicated formally and politically. On the one hand, lamentably, I think, Riggs participates in what would have been called at the time primitivism. There's a definition of it for you on the screen, but it was generally the use of world cultures as representatives of some kind of genuineness or authenticity that the corrupt Western world had lost during World War I. It might sound on the surface as if this is complimentary, but it's really not. It's incredibly patronizing and condescending, and to a certain extent colonial as well. One really clear example of how primitivism works out in the United States is in the photographs of Edward S. Curtis. This is one of his more famous photographs in a Piegan lodge. I've given you two examples of it because to emphasize the, quote, authenticity of these two Piegan men, Curtis took out this clock in the original print, and in the production process, he erases it because he didn't think it belonged there. The clock indicated that these two native leaders were actually very much a part of the modern world, but he didn't want to convey that at all. So there's a little bit of primitivism in Riggs's poem. At the same time, Riggs was writing the poem when religious traditions, Native American religious traditions, were still under threat. In 1883, the federal government, under the rules for Indian courts, banned a lot of Native religious traditions, including dances. They went through a process of trying to enforce those bans in the early 1920s, including in the US Southwest. And so for Riggs to write this poem celebrating the Santo Domingo corn dance, he's taking a very strong political stand that says these ceremonies, these traditions do matter, that they're significant, that Native people should not be prevented from celebrating them. So there is a little bit of primitivism. For example, he says that the dancers are naked. As Riggs knew, they did not dance naked. He knew this because he filmed them dancing a version of this dance in a film called A Day in Santa Fe that's also available online, that is an absolutely fantastic text for you to use to talk about Lynn Riggs. This particular film is about the tri-cultural world of Santa Fe, Anglo, Mexican, and indigenous. In fact, there's a final scene in it with what is called in the screenplay a Mexican orchestra. And so there are all kinds of ways that you could use this film to talk about diversity in the 1920s. We've given you one other resource for talking about Lynn Riggs, a short video by OCO TV, Cherokee TV, about Lynn Riggs. It's a short little 5-minute piece about his significance specifically to Cherokees. And then finally, I want to be conscious of the time here, and I'm feeling like I only have a minute or two left. Let me just say about Will Rogers then, that he's the stand-in for our humorist's voice. As you can see from some of the highlighted details of his biography, he spent his entire life entertaining people, whether it was as a trick roper, in a circus, on vaudeville, in Ziegfeld Follies, in film, in his newspaper columns. He did a weekly one, he did a daily one, and in books with titles such as There's Not a Bathing Suit in Russia, and other bare facts. And, you know, Rogers, I think a couple details, again, ones that we can return to in the later part of today's event. Two things. One, Will Rogers was very publicly Cherokee. People constantly talked about him as a cowboy. But he routinely and regularly reminded people that he was from rural Northeast Oklahoma, that he was born in the Cherokee Nation, and that was very important to who he was, whether he was traveling the United States or all over the world. In an article like Meddling in Mexico, a Summer Sport, when he objects to the US meddling in Mexico, intervening in Mexico, he does this from a very specific Cherokee point of view. The Cherokees, who, of course, were removed from northern Georgia in the 1830s on the Trail of Tears, who had an incredibly traumatic, divisive experience in the Civil War, where half of them sided with the Union, half with the Confederacy. In fact, the last Confederate general to surrender was a Cherokee, Stand Watie. The Union punished them for that as well. Then there was Oklahoma statehood and the loss of their tribal government. So Will Rogers, like all Cherokees, very much knows what it's like to be on that end of US meddling, US intervention. His daily telegrams and weekly articles are all available online and searchable too. This is really great for students doing research because you can go in and for example, type in Mexico and find all the times that he traveled to Mexico and all the things that he said about federal policies in Mexico, especially ones that were created to, in one way or another, suppress indigenous people in Mexico. And then the last couple slides are just a few more lists of resources for you. These are some of the works that I've mentioned with some links to them too. And then the last screen is just a link to a video that I created with some of my colleagues and graduate students that we often use in our survey to American literature courses, just to introduce students to how we'd like to talk about race and racism in our discussions. So I'll end there and pass it back either to